tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. There was a teacher named Master Hua who moved from Taiwan in the latter part of the last century to California and gathered a large group of really devoted disciples, founded the city of 10,000 Buddhas, a large monastery in California, and gifted the land that Abhayagiri now sits on. And he was renowned for his wisdom, his teachings. Longpo Sumedho said that he was the one person who ever reminded him of Ajahn Chah. One of my favorite stories about Master Hua and his disciples was that of a disciple he had, and at City of 10,000 Buddhas, they're very strict with one meal a day and not eating afternoon. But Arthur had a strong, or a large, weak spot for pies. And there was a pie shop down the street. And before he'd, I believe before he'd ordained or right after, he would sometimes go down and get a bunch of pies and just eat a lot of pies and kind of have a chance to blow off a little bit of steam. And one day he did this, but he didn't finish all the pies. So he brought one pie back with him and sort of put it in his room. And all afternoon during the meditation, he just kept thinking about the pie, back and forth, until finally, after a few hours, he was like, darn it, I'm just going to have the pie. It's afternoon, but I don't care. So in the evening, after the meditation had wrapped up, he snuck off to the most hidden part of the monastery he could find, which was up a roof shaft, up a hatch, and behind one of maybe the air conditioning vents up there where no one ever went. And he had his pie guiltily. And then he heard the roof hatch open behind him. And he thought, who could be coming up here at this time? And, quickly he got up and started walking meditation. And it was Master Hua. And Master Hua started walking meditation beside him. So both were walking back and forth until after a few minutes, Master Hua just cracked up and said, "Was it delicious?" But I share the story because I think it illustrates just the humanness and the frailty and the failings which most of us are walking this path with. And we can come to this practice and be so inspired by stories of Longpo Cha, by other teachers we have heard about and read about, by people we meet. And there's just a sense that we fall short. We go on retreat and it's not what we thought it would be. Or if it is once, it's not the next time. And I think all of us would honestly say that we wish we were farther along the path. We wish we were better. We wish we were purer than we are. And often as practice deepens, this ceases to be a deep, sharp self-recrimination and instead settles into this kind of low-level hum in the background of just, my practice is not where I want it to be. I'm not quite there. And it can be a bit like the Emperor's New Clothes, where everyone kind of feels this way, but no one really says it. And you hear someone else in a Q&A session mention jhana, And you're like, oh man, that sounds great. Maybe you touch something once and then it's gone. And it can be just this subtle sense of falling short. You know, we have burdens, there's family, there's jobs. We think a lot. Our meditations often aren't what we read about. And the sense of frustration and just a low-level disappointment. I think it's really important to note this and to turn towards it and really address it. There's a few ways, I think, of turning towards it. And one is to note that we read about these amazing teachers, and what we don't see or often forget is all of their histories, and that they weren't always like this, that each of them began someplace as flawed and frail as we are. If you believe in previous lifetimes, then sometimes perhaps that's where it was, but often it's just when they were young. Longpo Cha, as a young monk, talked about how sometimes in meditation, all he would think about was bananas, and his mouth would just water the whole time. He would sneak off to the noodle shop down the street and tell the noodle shop owner to close up the windows, and he'd have a lot of noodles. He really liked noodles. Or you hear about... It's interesting, if you read the Vinaya, the monk's code, most of the rules are formulated in response to monks and nuns doing things which are not terribly inspiring. And it's actually quite refreshing to realize that the Sangha, what you hear about is often the Arahants, the Anagamis, the great practitioners, Venerable Sariputta, Venerable Mahamoggallana, and you don't read about all those who were just trying their best. And some of them didn't attain. Many of them didn't attain. The Buddha says that even if one does not realize awakening, there are what he calls the trainee powers, which is something that everyone can have. And this is hiri ottappa, so a sense of conscientiousness and concern, a sense of kind of moral uprightness, basically. Energy, wisdom, and I think faith is the other. But just he says, if someone has these, they are safe in some measure, that this is at least some measure of refuge and something to rejoice in. But what you can read is in the Therigatha, the verses of the elder monks and the elder nuns, these verses from the time of the Buddha uttered by disciples. You have stories of, there's one monk, he looked back on his life in robes and felt like he hadn't accomplished anything, and he was going to commit suicide. And right before he kind of prepared the noose, he suddenly had this recollection, my entire holy life I've held good morality, I've upheld my role as a monk, I've done well. And the sense of goodness and uprightness that came from that brightened his heart, and I believe he attained awakening in the end. There's a story of one one layperson named Mahanama, who was worried that at his death he would fall to a low destination. And the Buddha said, do not worry, Mahanama, your death will be a good one. Even just as if one throws a pot of ghee into a cool lake, and the pot would break open, and the shards of clay fall to the bottom of the lake, while the ghee rose to the top. Even so, if the mind has long been nourished with faith, with energy, with samadhi, with wisdom, with mindfulness, then when this body breaks and is devoured by jackals, the mind will rise. Your death will be a good one, Mahanama. There's another story of Sarakani, and he passed away, and the Buddha declared that he'd been a stream enterer. He'd attained, at least perhaps at his death, a level of awakening. And all the lay people grumbled about, they said Sarakani was drink. He went to drink. How could he possibly be a stream enterer? Anyone can be a stream enterer these days. That's a quote from the suttas. And the Buddha said, if one has long gone to refuge in the Buddha, long gone to refuge in the Dhamma, long gone to refuge in the Sangha, then how can they fall into states of woe? Even so with Sarakani the Sakyan, Sarakani accomplished the practice at his death. And then he goes on, he says, even if one has not attained and does not have unshakable faith in the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, does not have vast and joyful wisdom, but if one's mind is established and has been nourished by faith, by energy, by mindfulness, by samadhi, concentration, by wisdom, these are the 5 indriya, the 5 faculties, a common list, and one feels confidence in the words of the Buddha, even they would not go to states of woe. To say nothing of Sarakani the Sakyan. Even if one does not have unshakable faith in the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, and does not have vast or joyful wisdom, but one's heart has been nourished by the 5 faculties, and one just feels a modicum of, I think it's warmth or endearing feeling towards the Tathagata, even this person would not fall to states of woe. If these sal trees could understand what was well and not well spoken, I would declare them stream enterers. How much more Sarakani the Sakyan? Sarakani the Sakyan accomplished the training at the time of death. So that's always heartening if the trees are in good stead. I think it is important to clarify in this sutta, unshakable confidence in the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha is equated with stream entry. And I think it would be a mistake to understand this sutta as saying that if one has any measure of faith that one has accomplished stream entry or can't fall into lower states. There's a lot of debate. If you want to get monks debating or nuns debating, bring up this sutta and see what happens. But what I think it indicates is it's the Buddha giving us encouragement that the refuges we've come to are not nothing. Maybe we haven't attained jhana, maybe we haven't attained stream entry, but we don't understand how powerful just holding right view and morality, the 5 precepts, are. This shifts a life. And often we don't see the change ourselves. It's like the light nimitta in meditation. Often people miss it because they're looking for a ball of light. But what it often is this whole mental landscape brightening slowly in the background. And similarly, sometimes our life, it's not the peak experience that draws our attention and lets us know that we've progressed. It's just that after 2 or 3 or 4 years of practicing, you look back and realize things are just brighter. Maybe you realize the word despair doesn't apply to you in the same way it used to. Maybe you're a little kinder. And when you consider that these habits of suffering we've gone through for lifetimes are so deeply ingrained, I've heard one nun compare it to being in a cesspit trying to clean it out with a toothbrush. This is not small. But we can't measure that progress on the usual XY axis that we're used to measuring our life and heart by. When we begin to practice, it's as if you open up a Z-axis and you're moving through this whole new strata of being. And your life can look a lot the same on the outside. The boss is still difficult. You still slip up. You still eat too many noodles some days or pie. But something else is happening in the heart that's profound. And you won't always see it. Sometimes it'll be the people around you that point it out after 2 or 3 years. But to really take heart, the Buddha said that even as a carpenter using an adze would not be able to say, today my fingers wore away this much of the handle, and today my fingers wore away this much of the handle. Even so, after years of using it, he would look at the handle and notice the imprints of his fingers. Even so, one wears away the defilements. So what's so meaningful there is that you don't always see this day to day. What you do is you look back and understand something has shifted. And it's also important to note there that the carpenter's not fixated on making imprints on the handle. They're just going about their work with the sharp end of the adze, of the kind of razor. But this soft thing is happening in the background with their fingers in the wood. And so you go about your life. Sometimes you do it imperfectly. Sometimes there's notes of defilement wound in there, but something's happening to the heart. And Ajahn Sucitto says 70 to 80% of the practice at the beginning is just watching the chitta brighten. I know Ajahn Achalo had a very difficult Vasa rains retreat at Wat Mapjan, where I ordained. And one day he kind of put his robe over his head and just screamed into it and went up to Ajahn Anan, my teacher, and just said, "When will it be any better?" And Ajahn Anan said, "In 5 years, it'll be a little bit better." So at the same time, Ajahn Sona, I know I've quoted this before, but I think it's so important. Ajahn Sona says, after 5 years of decent practice, you can expect your suffering to have diminished about 50%. And I think both are true. On one level, it seems like things aren't shifting, but on another, they really are. And just to take note of this list we call the 10 paramitas, they mean the perfections. They're not in the suttas, but it's this really common list of qualities of heart. There's dana, giving, morality, renunciation, energy, wisdom, patience, loving kindness, truth, determination, equanimity. But switch those the three of the last four, sorry. Truth, determination, loving kindness, equanimity. And often this is how, when you talk to people in Buddhist countries, this is how they frame their practice. I'm building barami, they say. And often that's the case. It's not that every person dedicated to practice in a Buddhist country or Buddhist context thinks they're going to attain awakening in this lifetime. For many of them, that's not even the goal. They're trying to build these qualities of heart. And I think that's a useful list because otherwise we can become so fixated on just how my meditation's progressing. And often for moderns, with our proclivity to thinking and overthinking and re-overthinking and doubting, Ajahn Anan would say that his Western disciples thought about twice as much as his Thai disciples. I think that metric is different now, that Western and modern culture is pretty much the same the world over. But compared to a rural society where people grew up with a lot more calm, people raised in a modern context think a lot. But Longpo Cha said, don't despair. You know, it's like you have a big house and it does take a lot longer to clean out, but then you have a big house to wander around in and to live in. And he also said, the reason I can teach well is because I had so much trouble at the beginning of practice. You read accounts of senior teachers who just sat and immediately dropped into jhana, and often it's hard to learn from them because they just say, well, just bring your mind to Buddho. What's so hard about that? And you say, I've literally tried that for 5 years. And so as we struggle with where we are, understand you're developing real skills, and you won't always know it until you try to talk to someone about your meditation. And you realize that each of those impasses you hit gave you some measure of wisdom. But the paramis are useful because it lets us not focus too much on just how the meditation's going. Because these refuges have real effect on the heart. And I've seen both paths at work. I've seen practitioners like Longpo Pasano who they meditated a lot, but they also lived in the community. They used ritual and the technologies of faith, of chanting, of giving, of morality. And then I've seen people who just go on retreat a lot again and again and again and fixate completely on meditation. And I can tell you that when the whole Eightfold Path is brought to bear, there's a synergy that occurs that is profound. And you can have faith that if you're holding good morality, if you're meditating a decent amount every day, if you're holding right view and knowing how to work with suffering with the Four Noble Truths, if you're coming into contact with spiritual community, if you're visiting monasteries, if you can. But just as much as you're doing that, something really profound is happening in your heart. And to have faith in that, that's such powerful karma. It can, so much of the bad habits we have get worn away by this, and we underestimate how powerful that is. Ajahn Chah would stress again and again, not the levels of awakening, not states of jhana. He would stress right view and morality. Right view and morality. So the beautiful thing about the Baramis is it gives us this wider metric. Maybe the retreat didn't go well, but you certainly built the parami of patient endurance. And that's not a consolation prize. The Buddha said patient endurance was the supreme incinerator of defilement. Or maybe you notice that there's a period in your life where you're caring for your children a lot and you don't have time to sit more than 20 minutes a day. But what about the barami of giving that you're cultivating, of dana? We have one community member who was interested in ordaining, and he couldn't, and had to sort of return to care for a child. And he said that his entire practice became cultivating the first three paramitas almost as a mantra: giving, morality, renunciation. What can I give? How pure can I act? What can I give up? And his entire practice became holding his role as a parent with utter integrity and beauty. And the Baramis let you do that. You can take one for a month or a year, but focus on that and don't discount that. Often you can put a lot of effort into meditation, but if you're not cultivating these other qualities of heart, it's like a chemical reaction where you have a limiting element. And often the limiting element is another aspect of the path. It's giving, it's community, it's faith. So you shouldn't discount those years where maybe you aren't meditating as much, but you're parenting and giving yourself in that way. All that to say, though, you should still be getting 20 minutes a day. If you can't meditate 20 minutes a day, you've got to be asking yourself, like, really? I can't make that much time? So 20 minutes a day, people. And more is good. I mean, obviously 45 minutes a day is very powerful, but sometimes that's just not in the cards. And that's okay. To have heart that like something profound is happening if you have stepped onto this path, and to take note of that. And to be forgiving with ourselves where we are as we practice. And more than that, to notice, we hear the analogy of the raft. The Buddha said his teaching was like a raft to go from this shore of samsara to the far shore of nibbana. And we often think of like a Tom Sawyer-like raft, like really nicely put together with logs. But the Buddha was very clear. It's the person on this shore gathering up sticks and twigs and whatever they can find, pieces of grass, and bundling them together, and then placing the raft just on their belly, paddling with their arms and kicking with their feet. So their limbs are hanging out over the raft. They paddle from this shore to the far. And the two arms, those are the right efforts of cultivating the wholesome and bringing into being the unarisen wholesome. And the feet are kicking the two right efforts of abandoning the unwholesome and preventing unarisen, unwholesome states from arising. But it's just enough of a raft to make it across. And that's what we have. Long Tam Mahabu would say, we think of practice as this staircase up a mountain, but it's much more like we're grabbing at pieces of grass and roots and just dragging ourselves up. And this is what we have. We have these broken personalities, these imperfect lives, the job that's not quite right. And that's enough. Whatever your life has given you right now, it can be the perfect place to practice if you really turn towards it with a full heart. And that alchemy, I've never seen a limit to how powerful that motion of heart can be, turning towards where you are and really accepting it and honoring it and having gratitude for it. Can every piece of difficult karma that comes your way be seen not as a retributive fist, but a hand of karma giving you exactly the lesson that you need to learn? Because without dukkha, without these difficulties, even without that subtle sense of dis-ease, how would we ever have motivation to separate out the citta, the mind and heart, from the conditions it's entwined with? Suffering is the friction that draws the heart away from the substrate of samsara. Otherwise, there's no motivation, and we find ourselves bound into that cloth and our hearts tied to that which is breakable. This is the untying of the heart, and your life is exactly right for it. There's changes we can make, but it begins with a motion of turning towards the conditions you find yourself in now. And Ajahn Sucitta says, personalities don't become enlightened, chittas become enlightened. Personalities don't become enlightened, chittas, the mind and heart, become enlightened. And to see that one of the most profound effacements and humblings of the heart happens with each project we have that doesn't quite go like we want it to go, that fails. That there's a deep humility and grace that one can find if one really sees the brokenness of samsara, and that things aren't quite right. The wheel's always slightly off kilter. That's one etymology of dukkha, a wheel that's slightly off. And that this is the situation. And to really turn towards that and ask that we become more humble, more caring, and watch as that self, with all of its goals and wants to control and self-recriminations, to have faith that as we practice, a deep transformation is occurring under the surface where the heart is growing brighter and all this crust that accumulated on the top is shedding. And to not overlook that subtle brightening, even if we haven't yet attained full awakening. So I wish everyone the best on this path and in this.
Han Thamayang Thamakataya Sadhu Karang Kathamase Sadhu 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 Anumodhami.
The sutta with the ads is called the Nava Sutta, N-A-V-A, the ship. And there's also this beautiful analogy of a ship steadily fading away on a beach. And even so, the defilements are faded away over time or disappear over time with the practice. And that's a sutta worth looking up, the ship. So we have a chance for questions. People can raise their hand and we'll run a mic over to you. Or feel free to raise your hand in Zoom if you'd like, and we'll call on you. But anything people would like to discuss, we can bring up. Did anyone relate to that talk? Subtle sense of frustration with practice? Okay, I do.
Can you speak a little bit to the habit of judgment?
I think it's such a stubborn and pervasive habit. I find with aversion, which is part of what judgment is, it's interesting to note that two of the three right intentions under sammasankappa have to do with non-aversion. So sammasankappa is the intention to renunciation, the intention to non-ill will, and the intention of non-harming. And I think it's very significant that the Buddha puts two of them in the realm of non-aversion, because I think it really is where we can reside much of the time. And what I also think that means is that you kind of need a rotating tool belt to address these deep-rooted tendencies. So for judgment, I mean, one important beginning point is just to have a metta practice in your day. 10 minutes of loving kindness somewhere in your day. It's especially helpful right when you wake up, because often your mind will go to the person you're having an argument with. The self will crystallize or try to crystallize around aversion and judgment. And just to note that and really steer the mind right when you wake up towards a wholesome meditation object, a word like love. Just keep the mind corralled very carefully right when you wake up, and it'll pay dividends through the day. Judgment, I find, can come up very strongly with the people closest to us, like our family, loved ones, because our self is so entwined with them. I find a counterintuitive but really important way of working with our loved ones is actually, when developing metta practice, to take a step back from them. And instead of thinking of the person as your mom or your dad or your son or your wife or your husband, think of them just as a friend in birth and old age and death in the practice, with their own lessons to learn, their own mistakes to make. And I find that stepping back allows this breath of fresh air where you're really allowing them to be their own person, and the judgment fades a bit. I think metta is a bit like a string, and if you're too close, sometimes it's slack. But if you pull back a bit, it can be taut enough to put a really beautiful note. But it's a counterintuitive movement, to step back a little bit. But the self is too entwined sometimes. The other thing to note is that when one begins practice, you're marshaling a lot of constructs of self to steer away from old habits, and there can be quite a lot of judgment at first. And just to acknowledge that's part of it, and to just take note and try to let it go when it comes up. But it is part of the process. And to just keep in mind, I think it was Ajahn Chah's admonition that you should be paying attention to yourself, watching yourself 90% of the time and others 10% of the time. To similarly recollect that all the, in the Buddhist view, everything we do that's unskillful is out of ignorance. If someone's behaving in a way that's detrimental, it's because they don't know what's best for their own welfare, and they're bringing great suffering to themselves in the long run. It's not helping them. And there's sometimes a route to compassion there. And the Buddha also said that all things converge on feeling. And I think that what that can indicate is if you trace back an unwholesome habit pattern in someone that you're judging, you can find below the initial incarnation of that habit pattern the suffering or vulnerability from which it springs. And this is applying the Four Noble Truths. So can you see the insecurity that's leading someone to always have to be the center of attention? Can you try to understand kind of the root suffering? And that can really undermine judgment too. So these are all just little ways, but that's a huge, there's much more that could be said. But for now, that might be enough. Is that helpful at all? Oh, person online, you can speak. Which person is it? Satcha? Satchan?
Hello, Bante.
Go for it.
Hello, Ajahn. Ajahn, I am from India. Actually, I have started into the practicing meditation, that is loving kindness meditation, through Bante Vimalaramsi. I'm experiencing the benefits of loving kindness meditation really. Like even recently, the talk of Ajahn Brahm, I inspired from Ajahn Brahm that daily morning we need to smile. Ajahn Brahm used to smile for 2 years in the initial practice. Just to share this information that smiling makes one's happy. Even Ajahn Tan says that next moment we don't know what will happen. We need to be happy in this present moment, and we should share this happiness. And to share this information, just I joined and I just subscribed this mountains, and I'm happy to hear this talk. Thank you, and wishing you all happiness.
Thank you so
Keep
much.
smiling.
Let's get 3 big
Yes.
sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu,
Thank you.
sadhu. Do you remember the specific technique that Ajahn Brahm used to make himself smile? Because it's pretty fun. The one where he pushes his... Can you do it just
Yes.
to demonstrate?
Yes. 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 I did not remember, but he says that early morning, whenever he wakes up in this beginning of the practice, he sees the mirror and sees whether he is smiling or not. And he used to practice this for 2 years continuously.
Yes, he would put his fingers on the corners of his mouth and make himself smile until he
Yes.
cracked himself up. It works pretty well, actually. You look pretty goofy.
Yes.
Thank you. It's great to meet
And
you.
one of my teacher, Bante Mullaramsi, I think you may be knowing him. He has written a book called Life is Meditation and Meditation is Life.
Yes.
He he says that life is supposed to be fun. Like he just tells to relax, whatever happening, relax and smile.
Yes, I think it's very important to bring to mind we talk about these lists sometimes and dukkha and all these things, but this is supposed to be a path beautiful in the beginning, beautiful in the middle, beautiful in the end. And there should be a sense of nourishment, of flourishing, of kind of happiness throughout it. And if that's lacking, if things are too dry, we might need to make our lips smile in the morning more. So thank you. Thank you.
Truly, thank you. Thanking you all. Wishing all happiness. Thank you.
Great. Okay, do we have another Zoom or in-person question? Oh, one over here.
Hi. So I am curious if you have any general counsel in terms of when one's experiencing roadblocks in their practice, the balance between diligence in one practice versus, I've heard rotating tool belt. And I'm curious about that personally, just because I have a propensity for trying a lot of different things, and then there's other traditions that talk about one strategy, and I'm curious if you could shed some light on that.
That's a great question. It's interesting because a lot of the meditation traditions that have come to the West, on the surface they seem very open because they don't have all this ritual and costume and statuary. But ironically, what it has led them to do is have to define themselves by a specific technique. And you see this very much in several of the most prominent strains of Western secular Buddhism is their identity is predicated on that technique, so they're very strict about it. And sometimes you can't even go to a retreat unless you're using that technique. The irony of the Thai forest tradition is, on the surface we seem very ossified, but because the identity of the tradition is embodied in these external elements and in its history, the meditation is very fluid. And I know monks who, their practice is recollection of bodhisattvas. I know sound of silence. Some focus on the breath. Some focus on lam rim. So all to say is that when you hear this is the technique, stick to it no matter what, just to see if it is originating from that sort of conceit of the Western traditions by necessity to some extent, and to be wary of it. Often when we begin to practice, it just takes a while to find a technique which really is onward leading. And it's useful, that initial phase of trying out different techniques, because you do end up with a tool belt. I spent a long time doing death recollection, where you just say, life is uncertain, death is certain, or I will die. And I don't use it much anymore. But if my mind's really proliferating, I know I have this very powerful sword in the tool belt I can just cut things with. So all to say, the analogy where you're digging in one place, and unless you keep digging in that exact place, you'll never hit water. The one place can be, roughly within the same tradition, I think is helpful at first, just so you're not mixing and matching too much. But to be willing to experiment a bit, you can kind of decide, like, maybe you do want to take on a certain approach for a month or 2 months or even 3 months while working with a certain teacher. But also I've done techniques where you just try it for a week and it's just not onward leading, and you kind of get a feel for it when that's the case. I think the important part is to not enter a meditation with too much fuzziness around what you're doing. And you don't want to be switching again and again within the context of one meditation. Like, set your goal, try it out. And I would use a meditation journal. So after a meditation, kind of journal what worked, and then have a little question mark, like next steps. My question is, when the mind is calm, do I let my mind expand to hold the whole body? Or do I focus on the nose? Or do I focus on the abdomen? And then next meditation, you've got a bit of a roadmap, a bit more. So wholesome doubt should be kind of systematic and onward leading. Additionally, if you really find you're hitting a long roadblock for quite a while, it can be helpful just to read different teachers within the same tradition, but with slightly different angles. And that can really freshen things up. So within our tradition, for example, if your breath meditation's at a dead end, try reading Ajahn Sucitta's Breathing Like a Buddha, or Shaila Catherine's Wisdom Wide and Deep, that's Burmese influenced, or Ajahn Brahm. And you'll find each of the teachers, it's the same kind of theravada angle, but it's just enough different that it can kind of give you a new approach. So yeah, the issue is that if you're getting caught in that unwholesome circling of doubt within the meditation itself, and you don't want to be switching too much, but if you try something for a week or two and it's not working, it's okay to switch. And eventually you probably will find what your base practice is, and often it'll be the breath. But then as to kind of your secondary object, often you can switch it up a bit more. There's more flexibility. So did that help at all? Thank you. Yeah, and to really take note of that mind state of doubt. It's a hindrance, and it's the one that hamstrings us most effectively, because every other hindrance we identify as unwholesome. If anger's coming up, we know it's not good. But when doubt comes up in meditation, we can think it's a legitimate part of the meditation. We're like, I just don't know what to do. Is this right? Is it not right? And you can spend your whole sit spinning off. And that buy-in is not helpful. The proper route when that kind of doubt manifests is come back to your home base of meditation. Maybe it's just a simple object. Identify the doubt. And don't try to solve the problem through the doubt. So... yeah. I think we have time for one more question. Mary. Oh, David, please.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Ajahn. I'm not sure if this is a question as maybe just a sadhu, extended sadhu. I really resonated when you talked about well, I'm paraphrasing it, the obsession with how well I'm doing in my program, in my spiritual development, and how easy it is. I just jumped right into this one. I can be incredibly attached to getting rid of my attachments, and very upset and angry at my aversions. And when I finally notice that, there's this joy of laughter that, oh my gosh, you're taking yourself so seriously again. And when you talk often about the playfulness inherent in the possibility of practice. My smile comes back without even needing to do that, because I can get serious, I can get focused on accomplishing things, and it becomes one of these multiple and multiplying hindrance attacks, like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, when he keeps chopping up the brooms, and they keep turning into more and more brooms. And at some point, if I'm lucky and don't suffer too much in the meantime, that moment of, oh my gosh, how silly this is. Oh, David, you're being silly again. And my oldest daughter's favorite thing to say to me is, oh, you silly man. And it comes back to me. So thank you so much for really presencing that really important point about progress and not perfection, about recognizing that we don't see our own development because it happens gradually. Just delightful. Thank you so much again, sadhu, extended sadhu.
Thank you, David. There's a type of wisdom the Buddha talks about called laughing wisdom, hasapanya. Hasa means laugh. It sounds like laughing. That's a beautiful term to have in the practice. And Ajahn Jayasaro, when we asked him, I think it was Mark that asked him what the most important quality he saw in people remaining in robes was, he said a sense of humor. So I think that's exactly right. We should probably wrap things up.